Psalm 30 showed up on the lectionary, and the Psalms are basically prayers. And so I'm a little surprised, but I find myself preaching about prayer. Do you remember the Paul Simon song where he says, I'm just an average, ordinary prayer, mainly in the key of C. And that's kind of where I find myself, but I'd like to get more deeply into prayer. I've been thinking about it. And often many churches don't preach all that often on Old Testament texts. So these were things that came together to lead to this sermon. So about prayer, but through the lens of Psalm 30. In thinking about prayer, I found Anne Lamott's reflections helpful, and some of you will know them. She has this three-theme understanding of prayer. And she says that prayers are basically in one or two or three types. And the first of these types is wow. It's kind of wonder at the beauty and goodness in the world, and especially in nature, the miracle of the sunset. Second type is thank you, in which we give gratitude to God for the good things we've received. And the third type is help. We're in a desperate situation. We appeal to God, maybe the only time in the last 5 years, but we do. And as they say, there's no atheists in foxholes. Now, not all of these themes are present in every prayer, of course. Many prayers have just one or two of them, and they get combined in different ways. So it's not an absolute schema, but I like the categories as a positive and encouraging way of thinking about prayer. Except that something is missing. Something that is found already in the experience of prayer in the Old Testament, and quite often. And this is what I think is a fourth form of prayer. Why? Why, oh God? Or more sharply, why is this bad thing happening to me? Or more sharply still, why have you done this to me? Looking at the Old Testament, it seems the more prominent a person is in the Old Testament, the more they are likely to question and even argue with God. When God asked Moses to lead Israel out of Egypt, Moses resisted and said, in effect, why me? I'm young, insignificant. Find somebody else. When God told Abraham that he and Sarah, his wife, would populate the whole earth, Abraham said, are you kidding me? We're ancient. We're 90 and 100 years old. It's impossible. Why do you even ask such a dumb question, God? And don't forget those famous prophets, most of whom rejected their calling at first and said to God, why are you picking on me? Go find somebody else, for goodness sake. So let's look at Psalm 30 for a bit in these four themes or ways of praying. But first, a word about the Psalms in general and where Psalm 30 fits into them. There's an awful lot of Psalms, 150 to be exact. People have classified Psalms in various ways. some that focus on the beauty of the natural world, some that lament about the miserable state of the world and the awful woes that are befalling us. Others promote the glory of the temple in Jerusalem, or King David as the ultimate example of kingship. Psalm 30 belongs to a group that's often called Psalms of thanks and praise. And that's exactly what happens in them. Thanks and praise to God for the good things that God has done, especially to me, to the writer. I'm the one giving thanks. The writer, or the psalmist, as we often call him, and it would have been a hymn in those days. We think of an intensely personal psalm, like Psalm 30, as a purely private affair. But most scholars think that most psalms had a connection to the temple in Jerusalem. In everyday life, wherever you lived in Israel, you practiced your religion by following the laws, the Torah, the dietary laws, and other rules that told you how to behave. So daily life was permeated with or by religion. But for significant religious events, it was the temple in Jerusalem where you exercised your faith. King David would celebrate a victory in war and the enemies he had slaughtered in the temple. But everyday, ordinary persons of all sorts also went to the temple to make a sacrifice, to pray for a success of some kind, to bring a lament to God, or to thank God for deliverance from death or danger, as Psalm 30 does. But those matters like that, you needed the formal ceremonial setting of the temple, the most holy and sacred space in all the world, the place where the God of Israel dwelled, and where you met God most directly and most intimately. So even the most personal psalms were likely part of some personal ritual in the temple, in that sacred and holy setting where you came closest to God. And I like that thought in a way. It gives a weight and a depth to Psalm 30, imagining it being spoken to God in that solemn setting. Well, let's see what the psalmist is saying then. The first kind of prayer, this wow of Anne Lamott, stands over the psalm as a whole. The guy was virtuous and sang God's praises. That's clear at the beginning. But that relationship with God was tested severely by an illness or other misfortune. But then the psalmist was restored and sang God's praises again. So wow is not just the wow of the sunset, the miracle of the sunset, but a different kind of miracle, a miracle of a personal salvation. But looking in more detail at the psalm, as far as thank you, that's the theme and tone of most of the psalm. Begins with thanks to God for salvation. I cried to you for help, and you have healed me. Weeping may linger for the night, but joy comes in the morning. And at the very end of the psalm, this theme of thank you returns triumphantly. You have turned my mourning into dancing, he writes. You've taken off my sackcloth and clothed me with joy. O Lord my God, I will give thanks to you forever. But something happened on the way to the end of the psalm, in the middle of the psalm. And that's where this third category of help comes in. For the psalmist, it must have been a rude awakening. He'd written that God had established him solid as a strong mountain. As for me, I said, in my prosperity, I shall never be moved. Until he was moved. Then disaster struck. A sickness unto death occurred. He cries out in his need to God for deliverance from his predicament. We don't know what befell this hapless psalmist, but it brought him to the brink of death. I think here Sheol and the pit mean the same thing. It's the early Old Testament understanding of the afterlife, which there was not a concept in Israel at this point of resurrection. It wasn't a kind of heaven or hell as we think of it. It wasn't even something fully personal as we understand the afterlife to be. But they couldn't imagine that people would just vanish and disappear into thin air. So Sheol was a place of ghosts, remnants, shades of those who had gone before. A teacher of mine, back in the old days of typewriters and carbon paper, compared Sheol to a filing cabinet full of fading carbon copies of the people we once were. In principle, Sheol was not a place you came back from. So the psalmist's despair must have been so intense that what he experienced was being snatched from the jaws of death. He had looked into the abyss, as some of us in this congregation have done, and been delivered by God. Behind this plea for help is this fourth dimension of prayer. Why? Why, oh God? Why have you afflicted me? And besides the actual illness, whatever it was, he was experiencing a radical separation from God. He felt God's anger. He felt that God was hiding his face, hiding God's face. He felt already in the pit, because there you have lost all contact with the world of the living and with God. Why? Is a question that lies at the heart of the psalm, and sometimes at the heart of our lives too. Why is this happening to me? We ask, or happening to those we love, or in the world around us. Psalm 30 is not the book of Job, where these issues are probed intimately, but it is Job light, and that is terrifying enough. Let's remember that other and far more generous understandings of God emerge already in the Old Testament. And today, most Christians and Jews would think of God very differently. But at the psalmist's time, perhaps 800 BC, 3,000 years ago, almost. This was a way of understanding God. God as immediate, visceral, loving, but also capable of anger. A God who wanted a direct and intimate connection with the people God had created. And a God who was ready to hear questions and complaints and lamentations and arguments. Personally, I'll bet God was impressed by the argument our good psalmist put up, pleading for salvation. What profit is there for you, God, in my death? If I go down to the pit, I won't be around to praise and worship you, and we will both lose. That's an argument worthy of a philosopher or an expert in logic. Not that I think the psalmist was trying to trick God, not at all. But just maybe that's what did the trick. In any case, God answers his desperate plea and restores him to health. And he does return to praising God, his creator and redeemer. His relationship with God is restored, and that is his ultimate experience of salvation. And finally, this reminds us of something about prayer. Whether we pray with words or in silence, at heart, it's about having a personal relationship with God. I've known people who have had a deep prayer life. Some were monks praying all the time in the monastery. Well, all the time, except when they were sleeping on stone slabs. Another person with a deep prayer life was my grandmother, who prayed every night in the quietness of her own living room, and who, though she knew nothing about the dating, authorship, structure, literary forms of the Psalms, was a way better Christian than I'll ever be. And all these people would tell you that prayer demands persistence, patience, and the will to engage with our God, who wants that personal relationship with us. God is waiting. And for that, thanks be to God.